working on the temple. And then they faced Jewish opposition. There would be Jewish farmers who would come, and they would shout down the workers who were working on the temple. It was an uphill battle. The very fact that the temple was built, and the temple that still existed when Jesus was there in the first century, Jesus often went to the temple. Jesus' apostles often went to the temple. A lot of the preaching was done at the temple. Healings were done at the temple. And in Acts, there was a massive conversion when the lame man was healed. Thousands of people were baptized. That all happened at the temple. So, clearly a very significant place of worship for the Jewish people. The very fact that that happened is a miracle. And we're going to talk about some of the other history that happened that makes it even more miraculous. Okay, so the north started to see some growth. They started rebuilding. There was still a fairly significant Jewish population, but there was also a massive Gentile population from all over the place. It was a really blended mix, which if you think about the Promised Land when the Jewish people came in, who all occupied that land? I mean, it was almost exclusively the Israelites, right? And then what did they start doing almost immediately? As soon as they came into the land, what did they start doing? Or who did they start worshiping? Put it that way, right? They started adopting gods and worship practices from other nations. It got to a point where we have extra biblical accounts where they're writing about the Israelites saying they're doing things that we wouldn't even do. The pagans who were wildly and grossly immoral in a lot of respects, they were looking at the Israelites and they're like, you people have lost it. It's pretty bad when the Israelites are making the pagan nations blush. Right? Things were really bad. Things were really blended. They were really integrated. So the north falls 722 BC, the south falls 586 BC, and now you have this problem of Jewish people. A lot of Jewish people have left this land, and they're living all over the place. And then you have other people who came in from all kinds of other nations, other cultures, other religions. They're now occupying Israel. So think about that from a religious standpoint. What would happen if our church was a blend? Well, there wouldn't really be a church because people were in their homes. They were confined to their homes. The temple was the central place of worship. People are now in their homes, and God is kind of like by this point, an afterthought, except for a remnant, which is the really cool part, because God does crazy things with a remnant, miraculous things with a remnant. Alexander the Great had a conquest in about the 330s, 340s BC. Alexander starts just doing this sweeping conquest and spreading Greek culture and Greek power all over the place. You have Alexandria, a city that was named after him in Egypt. The biggest library was unearthed in Alexandria. The Greeks were big into intellect, poetry, nudity, which the Jewish people didn't like at this point. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But their influence was spreading all over the place. The Greek Empire boasted a 200 million square mile radius. Think about that. 200 million square miles. Alexander the Great was just going around and waylaying everybody and putting governors in place and kings, and he was conquering the world. There was resistance to that, as there always is. There's always fight for power. We're seeing it in real time right now, right? People fighting for power. They've done it since the beginning of time. Cain and Abel. People fight for power constantly. When people fight for dominance and fight for power, there's always resistance. Certainly was the case for Alexander the Great. There was resistance to this. There were small pockets of groups that rose up against him. And then, interestingly, mysteriously, Alexander got sick, and for 14 days he was misdiagnosed, and then he just flops over dead. I have conspiracy theories. I'm just going to throw that out there. I think the dude was poisoned, but who knows? But he had this mysterious sickness. Nobody could, no doctor could diagnose it. And ironically, he died in Darius's palace. So Darius, the Persian king, who allowed the Israelites to build the temple, Alexander died in his palace in Babylon. So kind of interesting. So the Jews began to move freely and pursue opportunity throughout the known world. They were now free to move around. The Greeks had spread their influence, their political power, their political policies all over basically the known world, and they gave a lot of freedom. They gave people freedom to worship whatever god they wanted to worship, for the most part. Though they did put a temple to Zeus in every city that they conquered and set up. But people were still free. They were free to move. They were free to get whatever jobs they wanted. They were free to pursue wealth and happiness. Sounds a lot like America, right? So the Jews began moving around, and you might have heard the term diaspora. The Jewish people were now moving over to Asia Minor. They were moving to the east. And so in the first century, if you think about it, everywhere Paul went, where did he first start preaching, if he could find one? Synagogue. It begs the question, how did these Jewish populations get spread all over the place, everywhere Paul went? I mean, even in Rome. Think of how far Rome is from Israel, from the Promised Land. Right? You have these Jews who are taking up residence all over the place because they're pursuing better jobs, economic wealth, and growth. They're now free to move wherever they want, and they did it. So we're going to talk about Ptolemy for a little while. Ptolemy and his Greek rule, he was spreading influence after Alexander died. And kind of the staples of Greek culture were theater. There would be a Greek theater, a market, a temple to Zeus and Apollo and other Greek gods, and a gym where young men were educated and the sports were really big. And when I say young men were educated, we talk about very bizarre stuff. Somebody just this morning, I think Tex was talking about these weird moves to normalize pedophilia. It's happening right now. It's not surprising. You look around and look at how pagan our moral code has become as it relates to sexuality. And, like my friend in Canada, my good friend and old roommate used to say, you give them a centimeter, they'll take a kilometer. Right? People will keep pushing the envelope. And the Greeks were big time into nudity. They were big time into temple prostitution. They would paint these big pictures and have these sculptures. If you've ever seen any Greek art, it's usually what? Some naked dude sitting around, or naked women. Their gods and goddesses were always naked. Greeks were big into nudity. At these gyms, the older men would educate younger boys. Part of that ritual was eventually to have sexual intercourse. The older man would initiate with the younger boy, and that was part of the education. It was so normalized. And if you think about this, in Jesus' day, I mean, we're talking really not far removed from Jesus' birth, this was really normalized. Pedophilia was normalized, among many other things. And we're going to look at the Greek influence in some Bible verses here. Actually, while we're at it, let's look at Acts chapter 14, because you'll see that the Greek influence was all over the place. Acts chapter 14. It was deeply entrenched. We'll just start in verse 1. Now at Iconium, they entered together into the Jewish synagogue. Okay, interesting, right? Jewish populations all over the place. There are these pockets of Jewish people living in every city. They entered together into the Jewish synagogue and spoke in such a way that a great number of both Jews and Greeks believed. It's interesting, they're referring to the Gentiles, not as Gentiles often, but as Greeks. It shows there was a radical Greek influence that had been taking place since before Alexander the Great. Verse 2, but the unbelieving Jews stirred up the Gentiles and poisoned their minds against the brothers. So they remained for a long time, speaking boldly for the Lord, who bore witness to the word of his grace, granting signs and wonders to be done by their hands. But the people of the city were divided, some sided with the Jews and some with the apostles. When an attempt was made by both Gentiles and Jews with their rulers to mistreat them and to stone them, they learned of it and fled to Lystra and Derbe, cities of Lycaonia, and to the surrounding country. And they continued to preach the gospel. So you see this, the Jewish people and the Greeks, they're working together. They're plotting together. And at first you might be like, well, wait a second. Weren't the Jewish people like kind of restrictive? And, you know, you read in the Old Testament and they didn't really intermingle much at all with people who are not Israelites. No. The Greek culture was so permeated and the Jews so integrated and the Greeks so integrated in the Jewish land, in Israel. I mean, they were just so integrated together that they talked together, they worked together. This was very normal for them. Yes?
An exception should be made, though, or noted for Jews living in Israel at that time.
Yes.
So you have,
right.
for instance, Peter doesn't really want to go see Cornelius.
Very, very, very good point.
Because Israel was actually granted a great deal of independence in their religious belief and authority.
That's right. Okay. So for those who didn't hear that online, Charles said it's important to make to point out the exception. Within the land of Israel itself, the Jewish people were more secluded, except, interestingly enough too, in Galilee. Galilee and Nazareth in particular. Remember in John, can anything good come out of Nazareth? Right? We're going to look at why Nazareth was this kind of hot zone of Jewish people being put off by anybody who comes out of Nazareth. But very good point. Peter and Cornelius. Peter didn't want to have any association with any Gentile, right? In fact, Peter gets into trouble again in Pisidian Antioch. Antioch, not of Syria, the other Antioch, Pisidian Antioch. Paul, on his first missionary journey, Paul and Barnabas make great strides to preach to the Gentiles, and Peter unravels that in a heartbeat. And Paul in Galatians says that he publicly reprimanded Peter in front of all the brothers. And Peter repented, but Peter did great damage to those relationships that were made because Peter was from the actual land of Israel. Great point. And the Maccabean Revolt had a lot to do with that too, and we're going to talk about that. So much to talk about today. I get excited. This is such neat history, and it's history that we usually don't learn about in our Bible classes. Okay, Acts 14, going back to the text, starting in verse 8. Now at Lystra there was a man sitting who could not use his feet. He was crippled from birth and had never walked. He listened to Paul speaking, and Paul, looking intently at him and seeing that he had faith to be made well, said in a loud voice, "Stand upright on your feet." And he sprang up and began walking. And when the crowd saw what Paul had done, they lifted their voices, saying in Lycaonian, "The gods have come down to us in the likeness of men." Barnabas they called Zeus. Interesting, isn't it? Do you see the Greek influence? Right? Zeus is a Greek god. Barnabas they called Zeus, and Paul Hermes, because he was the chief speaker. And the priest of Zeus, whose temple was at the entrance to the city, every city that Alexander the Great went and conquered, he set up a Greek temple to Zeus. Isn't this interesting? You see this influence all throughout the New Testament, and if we don't know this history, we miss it. We just read this stuff and we're like, oh, well, you know, these pagan people who are living in this land, they rose up against Paul and Barnabas. No, this Greek culture was an integral part of everybody's life, including the Jewish people. Verse 13, and the priest of Zeus, whose temple was at the entrance of the city, brought oxen and the garlands to the gates and wanted to offer sacrifice with the crowds. But when the apostles Barnabas and Paul heard of it, they tore their garments and rushed out into the crowd, saying, "Men, why are you doing these things? We are also men of like nature with you, and we bring you good news that you should turn from these vain things to a living God." Uh-oh. Right? Capital capital O. Uh-oh. Paul just messed with a tradition, with a faith, with a culture that dates back to the time of Alexander the Great, and even a little bit before, but especially the conquest of Alexander. Big uh-oh. Verse 16, in the past generations he allowed all the nations to walk in their own ways, yet he did not leave himself without witness, for he did good by giving you rains from heaven and fruitful seasons, satisfying your hearts with food and gladness. Even with these words, they scarcely restrained the people from offering sacrifice to them. Do you see how integrated the Greek culture and the Greek religion is in all these communities? It is a miracle. It is a miracle, given the Israelites' history from Abraham, that there was any sense of pure religion to God, that there was any sense of cohesion, that there was any sense of unity. It's amazing. By the way, what happened to Paul right after? He's stoned. The people get furious with it. They're livid. Not only did you not let us worship you as Zeus and Hermes, but now you're saying, no. These are vain things. Let me tell you about the real God. He just healed a person, and they stoned him. That shows you how important their faith was to them and their culture, and Paul totally messed with that. Which says a lot about Paul's boldness, right? And a lot about our meekness as Christians, because today we're like, oh, I don't want to offend anybody, right? No. Well, yeah, no. One of you I know, right? You know, this is fascinating stuff. Okay. So I just wanted to point that out, that this influence was really deeply seated. Okay, so many Jewish people were put off by the Greek culture. Let's back up to about 300 BC, 200 BC. They're really put off by the Greek culture, by the nudity that's everywhere. They would take their kids out, and there's just nakedness everywhere. You know, it was stone porn, right? This pornography was everywhere, and a lot of the Jewish people didn't like it. The Seleucids started opposing the Greeks. And you have this rise and fall and this ebb and flow. Yes?
Remember, the Seleucids were Greek.
Yeah. True.
You've got
Yeah.
when Alexander dies, you've got 4 distinct Greek
Entities.
Yeah, I think that's
Yeah.
the right word.
Yeah. Right.
Rising up from it who then compete with each other.
Yeah. So yeah, good point. The Seleucids were Greeks. They're different entities or sects within the Greeks, and they're all fighting for power. Even the Greeks were fighting for power against each other. So the Seleucids they spark this oppression. It sparks this big revolt. The Seleucids then were really fascinated because there's this nice, shiny, brand new temple sitting in Jerusalem, which meant what? Power, money and power, influence. So what do the Seleucids want? What would be their goal? Not just in taking the temple, but in taking what? The high priesthood, right? The high priest is the most powerful political, religious, and monetary position. And so the Seleucids they're bribing, and finally, I think it was Antiochus the fourth becomes high priest. He's a Seleucid, and for the first time since Solomon, somebody from the line of Zadok, who was Solomon's high priest, somebody not from the line of Zadok takes the high priesthood. This is amazing. And the Jewish people didn't like it, right? Because Ezra and Nehemiah come in, they're preaching, they're restoring this religion. It'd be like us having, right? We talk restoration. We're part of the restoration movement. What does that mean? We're restoring the church back to what? Right, the first century Christianity. That's our claim, right? We're restoring the church back to first century Christianity. Well, what's happened in the last few years the last 2 decades, longer than that, but I mean, especially the last 2 decades, a lot of people within the Restoration movement are saying, who are we? What is going on, right? So the Jewish people were livid. They're like, no, we just built this temple. It's still brand new. It still has that new smell to it. And here the Seleucids are coming in, and they just literally dethroned, but they removed the high priest and made themselves the high priest. They revolt a little bit, give a little pushback. So Antiochus IV, the Seleucid, he bans Jewish law in retaliation. So the Jews who were free to worship, right? They were free to worship. They were free to practice their law, free to practice their religion, along with all the pagans. Everybody's free to worship their own God, do whatever you want, anything goes kind of thing, which was good for the Jewish people. They're now banned from worshiping. And by the way, you know what the punishment was? Severe torture, persecution, and death. They're right back to square one. And they're having none of it. At this point, the remnant, they're really fed up. So there's a Jewish priest by the name of Mattathias who, when it came his turn to bow down and worship the pagan gods, guess what he did? He stuck a big, proverbial number 1 up in the air, and he said, I'm not going to do it. So Mattathias said this. This is a direct quote from Mattathias. He said, let everyone who is zealous for the law and supports the covenant come out with me. And he began to fight, and fight he did. He's killed in the line of battle, and he's fighting for what? He's fighting for religious freedom. Does that sound familiar? Right? These cycles have been going on since the beginning of time, and they're going to continue to go on. There's an ebb and a flow, there's a give and a take, there's a push and a shove, there's a rise and a fall, and it's been since the beginning of time. But this is interesting because this is in that intertestamental period, and this is the political and religious climate to which Jesus was born into. That's fascinating, and that's important. So Mattathias' son Judas takes over this revolt, this Jewish revolt. His nickname was Maccabeus, which is where we get the Maccabean Revolt. Maccabeus means hammer. Do you think he was a little softy? Do you think he was a pushover? Do you think he was like, oh, well, I got to be careful not to offend anybody, and we're just going to make peace treaties and all hold hands and get along? No. Judas Maccabeus, Judas Hammer, was vicious. He was a warrior. And so he, interestingly, was able to get this Jewish and Roman agreement because Rome now, right, is starting to come to the surface, which surprised a heck of a lot of people, and it still surprises modern scholars today. Rome is coming to the surface, and they're like, hey, wait a second, we want to get in on this power thing. 200 million square mile radius of Greek territory, and now Rome is saying, hey, So they strike this peace agreement with the Jewish people, and they say, hey, we're going to come in and we're going to start to help you. Judas gets killed. His brother Jonathan assumes the role, takes over as the Maccabean Revolt. Interestingly, Jonathan Maccabias, he makes a fatal mistake. He's a warrior, and he's getting a lot done, and he's advancing, and he's helping the law of God, to be preserved and all that. He says, this whole high priesthood, that position of high priest, I think I want it. That didn't sit well with his Jewish brothers and sisters because he had so much blood on his hands. He was a ruthless warrior. And they looked at this as a big political move, which is really essentially what it was. And so now you have these dissenting groups that start to be formed. Do any of these names sound familiar to you in reading your New Testament? Zealots, Essenes, Pharisees, Sadducees. One man, Jonathan, one decision to assume the high priesthood starts sparking all these groups. Guys, every decision that we make matters. Every decision is important. Every decision has consequences that will last forever. Jonathan assumes high priest, and now you have Essenes, you have Zealots who crop up, and then Simon, his brother, takes over. You now have the Jewish council, which is also called the Sanhedrin. You've read about that in the New Testament. They become divided. The legal system for deciding, the Jewish court for deciding everything, all things Jewish, it's their court, it's their legal system. It's now radically divided, and it divides into a conservative group called the Sadducees, and a more liberal group, believe it or not. You look at Paul and you're like, Paul was a liberal? A more liberal group called the Pharisees. Well, what did the Sadducees not believe in? Resurrection. The Pharisees believed in resurrection. They believed in, spirits and ghosts and, all kinds of things. Isn't it interesting when Jesus, think about this, when Jesus is walking across the water, do you know what his disciples said? It's a ghost. Isn't that interesting? That wasn't a Sadducee who said that. It was a Pharisee. And Jesus, incidentally, when he called his 12 apostles, he's gathering Essenes. He's gathering Pharisees. I don't know if there were any Sadducees. Did he have any Sadducees on the 12? I'm not really sure. But he's mixing zealots. He had zealots. as his apostles, and he's grabbing these people who were radically opposed to each other. It's fascinating. Okay, so Simon's son, John Hyrcanus, I think is how you pronounce it, he takes over the revolt. And now you have Syrian vassals who they break away. They break away from, as part of this big revolt, and, you have all kinds of groups now that I think nobody knew which way was up and which was down. This was pure madness and confusion, which again shows the miracle that the Jewish faith and the Jewish religion and the Jewish people survived this. It's a miracle. And I'm kind of out of time, and I'm sad about that because I guess it's a good place to stop. But yeah, I know. Yeah, I'll leave you hanging, but it's fascinating. It's so fascinating. This intertestamental period, so much ink has been written on this period, and Christians are like, just read your Bible only. Well, we miss so much when we do that. Because the Bible, the New Testament, is saturated with Greek influence, Greek culture, Greek religion, and synagogues. You ever wonder where synagogue came from? Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, Zealots. We just read these and we're like, oh, well, the Old Testament ends, you don't find any of these things, and then all of a sudden you open up the New Testament and here they are. Huh. And we just keep reading like no big deal. It's a huge deal. It's a huge deal. If I can find my little clicker, I'm going to ring the bell. And I'm going to end on this note that, even when we're living in troubling times, it's fascinating because God is always God. God always has been God. God always will be God. God will always bless. God will always bless his remnant. God will always bless people who fight for him, who fight for this. Because essentially, the Maccabean Revolt wasn't about power except for a few people who, now I'm drawing a blank. Jonathan, I think. Yeah, Jonathan, who wanted to become high priest. But it was about preserving this. It was about preserving God's word. And were it not for these people who fought, for the small remnant who fought an uphill battle, think of what they were up against. We wouldn't have the temple. We wouldn't have the Bible. We wouldn't have synagogues and all these little spur-offs where people were just fighting to hang on. We wouldn't have them. And I think today we're like a lot of Christian friends that I know are like fighting technology, and they're fighting house church, and they're fighting churches being shut down because of COVID. They're fighting all these things, and I'm like, we got to pick our battles. God will bless us in the midst of all this stuff. He always has, he always will. The church will not die. The church will not die. So I'm inspired. I think it's really cool. It's really encouraging. A lot of cool history. I'm going to stop there. We'll see you in a few minutes.